fate described herein should not be proven to exist, I suppose, because if you believe in fate, then you believe in a higher power, or at least some blind substance in the vacancy, elected to control us all. And since the origin of this subtle divinity cannot be so disproved, much less than lacking origin could his fate be proven, by which I mean the weird fate of this volatile grouch, who for many years had thought himself complete, and believing that he had adequately explained himself, saw everything on earth that lived and breathed as being contingent on a purpose that was not there, and thus perceived this as emphatic proof of no such God, because surely no higher sentience would allow him to rage alone within his head for years within his shitty apartment, only to hear one day a voice that said how all control was a hindrance, that his ineffective search for what was ultimately artificial magnitude preserved in lies, and breaching nothing but overtures to an argument never known in full, God had inevitably and failed to explain to him in subtler ways how there was no genuine control existing beyond the sentiment of his own, that unfortunately still does not fully manifest itself in anybody. It still is divisive, and has one foot in anarchy and the other in control, and although either poles may seem vast to him, they will run short the vaster length of God, laboring to speak the particle of a diviner substance for the benefit of this old human, to hear within his mind one day the makeshift of the brittle speech of God will shake his bones, and so this little man by God appointed as unwilling medium between itself and him, now hunching over his own translucent face and fondling with an absent purpose the handle of a frail teacup ringed with sediment at the bottom, and sitting complacently next to a pair of keys and a dirty novel on the nightstand by an old chair in which this man now reclines. And so the business of this man is what it usually is, that is, a profoundly negative personal reflection on his life and all the errors of malnourished life, approached with calculated severity, and nobody sensing the insignificance of his banal sojourn through an existence that never quickened, would think that such an obstinate, aimless, and evil man, who in denial does not narrow down his perturbed disquiet to reasons that growl in a hungry psyche not well enough to equipped to shroud his uneasy disdain for simple human contact, could ever be chosen to witness the bray of this giant apparition, surviving in broken words that shift between the syllable, each wild sacrosanct, haunting each wild sacrosanct, with cracking vibes that expose a sort of piecemeal desperation that seems to bother silence, whistling through the figurative holes in tacit knowledge, just to dissemble the mercy of this little man in his own nomadic quiet, interrupted after hanging like a musk about his theoretical room, furnished with not much else but ghost trinkets and uninteresting wallpaper. In such a way God speaks to him, and trusting just a particle of itself for the man to hear and then correctly translate, the broken words that opt to mesh into his existence become familiar as they inhabit a place or object viewed by him, yet he knows it as not a part of him. And the divine amplitude will not return from what is seen and touched and felt and smelled, because the man cannot distinguish between what he sees and God, whose place is in obscurity. And so this empty human that God has spoken to attempts to focus the sublime object, displacing ephemeral notes to form a voice, breathing calm to substance, and raveling out like yarn the nothing of his reasoning behind so stiff control. And then it is his God that finally can muster up the courage to reveal itself, but only in the particles lodged within the scene, but they are seen by him as though unseen, nesting inside the failing eyes of this daft and solitary human, lusting long for remedy to soothe the racket in his pliant brain, caused by a failure to connect the feeling of this insistent voice to what cannot be understood, because to understand the voice of God is to understand God, which is impossible. He detains the substance in his mind for a little while, and though it is beyond him, he will try to accurately condense his God by naming elaborate names for something deceptive in how large it seems to him. However, what is vast to us is not so vast at all to God, who, whispering approximations reminiscent of the subtle talk of sex, is heard again by this pithy lunatic, just wanting to find it out. Throughout his life he suffered and could understand only anguish. So at first he sculpts the endless particle in the likeness of his own magnificent sadness, while his God remains unsaid, even though he makes the attempt to say it, then discovers that the problem in defining this must lie in deciding which name is best to leave unsaid, and which name is better to dismiss by claiming it as true. And by doing this he finds that what really suited him best was to destroy each particle of God completely, and leave out any name at all that could describe it. And so he reneges to an acceptance of things as being without control. One must lose control in order to unearth each place that is both substance and a place in which he could tune his dreams to shape an inclement world out of the spoken particles, building each upon formidable hypotheses undone enough to collapse the strength and leave the reason blemished and the order never cured for as long as it exists. And so it will remain tragically infected by whimsical convolutions, simple qualms, diminishing the deity in himself, and likewise to abandon lesser deities just to find the one that was before, the one that at the very start existed as a part of the struggle to develop something he can never be, is a concept relegated to feverish faith that, haunting his big mind, only manages to shrink his own endlessness to fit the soft and hard dualities, thrust and wane, inherited each to each as votive to withstand mortality, and to curtail the sense by breaking it down to ultimatums that endure before perishing the blunder of his impassive rote, to follow all the cancelled dreams that draft across the synapse, leading to something that I can see as clearly in my head as the denial of reality that grows the limits out of life, when humankind, hurting itself in the chase to correspond a wider span to each circumference, has forced each finite house to represent the finite God. However the substance of fate is arranged, he thinks it cannot be without the birth and stopping of himself, who crops the edges of a finished God and plants the seeds of intimate questions all his own, instead of questions given to him by the deity. If he knew those questions, then he would know also the answer to them, and so he strikes the fragile membrane to expose the meaningless nucleus. We should not disregard this as bullshit. Instead, we should embrace what cannot be discovered, for things we humans cannot fully grasp are things we respect for their ability to elude us. We should embrace the things not fully grasped, because there is a kind of infinity expressed in these things that bawling vows to end before the system suffers down to disjointed motion, and I am left alone to encircle the people of my old mentalities. I light a fire to suffocate each assumption and see them burning in the torpor of their own disgust for something once treasured by me. The furtive sickles of the flames reflected like weird beasts within the eyes of falsities destroyed. I see them now for what they are, and as they die, the people lurking in my brain begin to hiss and yell at me, as they have only themselves to judge now, as shady manipulators of what I once had thought to be what always had to be. They burn in the wreath of the fire. I am not wrong, I am civil, and surrendered to hatred. How is it possible to go on without an answer? The thing is that there are such people, but they do not exist except within that ageless part of the brain, the prolipsis of things to come, coming before I realize spew the ultimate chaff, richer than grain. This purely infinite dispersal of viewpoints and opinions siphoning back eternally through foreign branches to the ends that could rewind the network and leave me between where I began, whereby the journey itself shall alter my intended destination, in that the destination is hauled off to between where it once was, and all the finite ends and beginnings suddenly lead to an intense feeling of crushed power that shakes like an epileptic. One must compare the situation described herein to something, so why not make it something simple, like the question of this final truth? Insistently the qua 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 signals ignorance, ignorance, by trashing the strange and last doom among the dooms, that unceasing warming, the only static pressure of this, our abrasive universe. Mystery proves only the expanse of that universe and the fact in the largesse of the fact. One might define the quiet for so long within the largesse as accurate when compared to this bane of human leeway, refractory relative assumptions that count what cannot be counted, unspirited fingers and the fingers on the hand that has for so long gripped to the steep knell of the fact as it hangs out over the murk of silent fantasy. A void is created, is like the reality created by the silence, except the reality is stifled by the void created in my tongue and remains a fantasy. This failure to name the nuance of the piece that could have grown from an infertile silence. And I scream, just to forget the winnow of my voice again, by permitting that it be heard once, and only once, so that it may pass forward through abyssal time until the other side of time is come upon. Another stoicism, ahead of the sound and out of memory, since one can only remember the past, which does not bother to reckon up the apparitions of an ongoing future that is loud in the corners of the past, while the past maintains a breathy quiet. In the center, mystery fosters searching. The unconscious purpose of searching is, to me, to attain perfection. However, that perfection cannot really be reached, ever. In other words, mystery draws a fragment out of things that could have been intact. I can make the wise attempt to muscle this absurdity neatly together. But this effort might only bring the world round as it can be by seducing it with fragments of nobler truth, nobler screams that would, I guess, disprove the quieter, plainer truths. Their whole is to the extent that they need no reprieve from infinity, because infinity does not exist for quieter, plainer truth. And yet this whole is only come by relenting to myth-making, and this is comforting to me.